Now we need to add our token to the HTTP request for the secret recipe. And I'm going to do this using an HTTP interceptor. In Angular, HTTP interceptors sit in a message processing pipeline, and Angular will invoke methods on each interceptor for every outgoing request, for every request error, for every incoming response, and for every response error. What I really need is just an interceptor that hooks into each request so that I can take the current user's access token and add that as a header. So tokens are much like cookies in that they go along in an HTTP header, but we need to explicitly add that as a header to every outgoing request because the browser is not going to do that for me. And I will place this interceptor into a file that I already have set up called addToken.js. Ultimately, what this has to do is be a factory for a service that has a single method attached to it, one called request, because that will get called for every outgoing request. If I put a response method there, the response method would get called for every incoming response. But I'm just interested in the request. So request is a function that will take the configuration object associated with this HTTP request. So that's the object that will hold the URL that we're going to, the headers, the timeout, the data. All I'm really interested in is modifying the headers. I could look at the URL of this request and determine whether or not I need to add a token. Perhaps everything going to /API/something will need a header, but other requests don't. Just to keep things simple though, I'm going to add the authorization token to every request if the user is logged in. And I can tell if the user is logged in or not because our current user service has a property available off the profile member that we created. It's called logged in. And so if the user is logged in, I want to go to config.headers and create an authorization header. The authorization header has to come in a specific format. In this case, it needs to be the word bearer followed by the token itself. So my web server will be set up to understand bearer tokens, and that will be quite common whenever you're using tokens. I just need to grab the current user, go to the profile property, and pull off the token. So that will create that HTTP header for me. It will say authorization : bearer space and my token. And that will go into every request once the user has logged in. And then every good HTTP interceptor, or at least the interceptors that are intercepting every request, should return the config object that is passed in but wrapped into a promise. So I will also inject the queue service and use queue.when to create a promise that will just immediately resolve with that value of config. And that should be all the code that I need to add the token to every request. Now I just need to set things up so that this is a proper interceptor. First, I'll register my factory method for this service. The factory method for add token. Dear Angular, please call this function, which is add token. And then my module will need a little bit of configuration. So module.config, what we need to do is write a configuration function that takes $HTTP provider, because it is the HTTP provider where I can register interceptors. So HTTP provider.interceptors. So yes, you can have multiple interceptors. I'm going to push the value of the string value add token into that array. And now when Angular sees that at runtime, it will instantiate this service, plug it in as an interceptor, and hopefully be calling my request method for every HTTP request. Let's try it out. Back in the application, let me come to the home view and do a hard refresh. Let me try to log in as sallen. And now let's go to the network tab and let me click see today's secret recipe. And it looks like today's secret recipe is French toast. Wonderful. I can see that request went out down here. It was a 200 response. I can see the data in the response. And in the headers, I can see that my access token made it into the HTTP headers thanks to this add token service. So quite a few components floating around, but ultimately we wanted to divide up responsibility so that we had one service responsible for taking our username and password and formatting it and posting it to an OAuth server, grabbing the response token and giving that to a different service that represents my current logged in user as sort of a global singleton, and then a third service which is registered as an HTTP interceptor that will take that token and add it to every request so I can get to things like the secret recipe, which require an authenticated user.